Welcome to the Obesity Medicine Podcast with your host, Dr. Matea Rentia, board certified in internal medicine and obesity medicine. Here, we talk about a path to metabolic health, and we have real conversations about chronic weight management and living a full life. Just a reminder, I am a physician, but I'm not your physician. So everything that's on this podcast is for informational purposes, but please go talk to your doctor about what's right for you. There is no medical advice being given on this podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today, I'm really excited because we have psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Hochman, and I have really wanted to bring a physician on the podcast to talk more about the emotional aspect with eating with food. And I don't know if we want to put the word addiction in there, but as we talk a lot about on the podcast, it's really multifactorial when you're struggling with things. I talk a lot about the physiologic aspect, but we do talk about emotional eating often because you might be, quote unquote, doing all the right things with nutrition and movement and things like that. But if you can't get stress management and the emotional aspect under control, I'm going to ask you when you introduce yourself, what percentage you think the struggle is for people. But I think it's more than 50% of the struggle to having health long-term is really understanding the emotional aspects. Before we go further, can you introduce yourself to my audience? Just tell us a little bit about where you practice, what your area is, so people have a little bit of background.
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist. I've got a practice in Austin, Texas. I only see patients that want to do psychotherapy, so I do med management only. I do med management alongside the therapy, though. Yeah. And so I say that just to help viewers understand. I have a very strong focus on the psychology of things and really look at the underlying issues. So what I most enjoy doing with patients, what I talk or write about is always to do with underlying issues. So that's what I enjoy and spend a lot of my time learning and doing. I also have an online recovery addiction program that incorporates those all together where people can understand where it comes from and how to manage it.
Yeah, it looked really good. I was looking at it. By the way, I'm always curious, how did you come to work in this area? Because I'm always curious what drew you to it.
Yeah, I thought I was going to do emergency medicine. I had some background earlier working in that area, just loved it, really. And it was enough sort of experience through medical school that by the end, I realized that my greatest curiosity is always around how someone wound up where they are. And so it just kept pulling me this way.
Yeah. That's interesting that you bring that up. That's 100% how I ended up in obesity medicine, because I was like, we're always treating the end product, but we're not ever really getting down to the roots of things. And so I just find like we have different brains and then we end up in the right specialty based on that. But let me start out here with just asking, just in general, so this doesn't even pertain only to food, but how do you define addiction in a medical sense versus something that's just a habit or a strong preference that you have? Like, when does something actually turn into addiction?
There's a case where the lay kind of person perspective on addiction is way more accurate than the so-called medical or clinical one. Clinically, there's criteria for substance use disorders. Addiction is not a diagnosis. Clinically, it's called substance use disorder. Then there's different substances to name. And so alcohol would be the most common one. There's 11 criteria. And then if you have just a couple of them, that'd be a mild addiction. That'd be a mild substance use disorder. Okay. So I won't get too far into it, but that's a clinical classic sort of definition of addiction. And that's contrasted with a more layperson idea of, oh, well, I'm so addicted to chocolate. I'm so addicted to my phone. That actually is a closer description, even biologically, strictly speaking, to what addiction really is. Because we, for example, if you do want to use the hard science or functional MRI, which shows how much the brain activity is in certain regions, the addiction portion of the brain is lighting up more for behavioral things than even cocaine in many, many instances. So with what we're talking about, sugar, for example, lights it up more strongly and robustly and predictably than many drugs, even hard drugs. So that's where it can be very confusing when you're trying to look up in textbooks or into the medical world for these answers, because they really, really miss what addiction is. Okay, well then what is addiction, or how do we define it? The government defines it as this compulsive thing. You just keep doing and doing the substance despite harmful consequences. That's the classic definition. I define it as it's when we turn to something outside of us and we use that to regulate an internal emotional experience. We can break that down because it's packed actually with lots of things. It sounds very simple, and it is in a way, but each of those words in there means a lot. Just one launching point for us is we're turning to something outside of us. Okay, that could be alcohol or drugs, but way more commonly in practice, it's a behavior. So it could be food, it could be social media, right? It can be all kinds of things that we're turning to outside. And these, again, just to reiterate, they are producing a discernible, detectable, scientific, psychological, brain, hormonal, chemical reaction. And there's a lot of dopamine, even by a classic definition where you got lab science, is still definitely addictive.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really nice definition that you gave. Because I like to think that everyone just wants to feel better. They're just looking for things to feel good. And so I often have a challenge with patients that when they come in, about 99% of their world is that food is giving that to them. But in some capacity, it's hurting them. Either their weight set points up and their blood sugar is up and they're having consequences from it, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't be dabbling in this area. What I struggle with them is building out ways that they can get pleasure in their life that do not involve that, because when it's been part of everything, it's a struggle for them. So one of the things that I see being part of that is emotional eating. I actually wonder how you define it, because I define it as eating for any reason other than physical hunger, that you're using food to satisfy some other need. Do you define it differently?
Yeah, pretty much. I would only add that it's to regulate usually a negative emotional experience. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
That can range from you've got a heavy trauma background and you have all kinds of mental illness, but also just to very mundane things like you just had a stressful day or you're bored or you're just in a marriage you're pretty unhappy with. So it can be really severe and also quite mild.
Yeah. I like that you brought up the spectrum, because I think everybody always thinks about, if I use the term big trauma, I think they might think about that, but they don't think about really anything can lead to this, right?
Right.
If people come to you with that, how do you start to work on emotional eating? Because I find it's a real beast in sort of the inroads. So do you have any kind of strategies?
Yeah, I'll kind of lay out a framework that I think is useful and also not too hard to wrap your head around. I think of addiction then, if we break out the way we're talking about it, right? That you're trying to regulate some negative experience internally with something outside of you. I call it a current of addiction because it feels like you're being swept from an okay state into something bad. So it starts with some negative feeling. And like we said, it could be really severe, it could just be super minor, just a negative feeling. And that's the beginning of it. Okay. There's an emotional pain, I usually call it. The next phase of the current is the brain coming up with a way to get out of that. That's what people would call a craving. It's just the desire that we naturally come up with to get out of that pain. Now we're already at the second point in the current, but we still haven't actually done the thing. So that's still just a cognitive or emotional process. After that, then when we partake in the craving, is the real turning point for any addiction, whether it's alcohol or food. So when we partake in it, it's that person in some fashion manifesting that they can no longer tolerate that experience. So they feel bad, they're thinking of a way out, and then it cannot tolerate but carrying that out. And so there's a lot that happens there that we can get into as much as we want, but there's a lot in that step psychologically and behaviorally. That next part is when we partake in it, right? And then the last part of the current is that there is a positive reward. And I call that a false pleasure part of the current because it's pleasurable, of course, or else why would we be turning to it to begin with? But the false part is what we all know. It's not going to be a lasting, enduring, good for you behavior. And then the aftermath, which is for any of these, right? Whether it's a drunken sort of aftermath or with food, there's hormonal issues, there's blood sugar issues. And then ultimately, the real big one is the shame. It's like, I'm hiding this thing. I know I'm hurting myself. Why can't I stop? We start to hate ourselves. We get confused. We question things. And there's just all that sets in. And so then it's back around because now we're managing the negative feelings of what we've done. And that's what happens in addiction. It goes round and round.
Yeah.
But back to your questions, I wanted to give some context. I begin not usually addressing the most underlying huge part of the pain in the beginning of the current. Usually I look at, okay, well, if you're turning to food in this instance, what are some healthier foods to turn to? So I'm big on harm reduction. I'm not a purist. I think that anything we can do to move towards healthier is healthier. And so just keep it simple, right? So if you're turning to a pint of ice cream and you can shift that to chocolate covered almonds, well, almonds are healthy and you got a little bit better stuff going on. You got chocolate though, and you got a lot of palm oil, and it's not great, but definitely better than the ice cream. And then you graduate from there, and you can still get some good pick-me-ups, and you could shift to fruit or just there's plenty of creativity with food to try and get healthier things. Often, like bedtime, I'll help people look for saltier things that aren't so terrible if they don't have a huge reason to avoid that salt intake. Even high blood pressure, many people with high blood pressure don't get worse with higher salt intakes. Not everyone has a salt dependent hypertension. So pickles and olives are things that still provide some exciting sense to it, but don't really come with the harms. So we look at, can we harm reduce? And then we go back upstream. So then can we build a tolerance for the want? I want ice cream. Can I stand in front of the fridge and just be? That would be a practical sort of strategy to use. But if you can do that, you've won, right? In so many ways.
Yeah. First of all, it's so interesting that you call this the current of addiction. That's what you called it. And I was literally explaining to my friends the other day, I'd come back from vacation. I had put on a few pounds with vacation and I was really trying to get back into my routines, right? And I was explaining to them, I feel like it's a riptide and it's happening. I'm in a certain thing. I know once I'm out, I can swim either way. But I knew in those moments, like this is feeling so horrible. And I know so many strategies and I get myself out of it. But it's like after my whole life having struggled with obesity, it's a thing, right? And so it's so exactly how you describe it. I'm like, yes, you know what you're talking about. This is amazing. So I love it. And I like how you don't start with what's the feeling? What's that big thing? Because I find 100%, I find in the clinic, no one can even tell me what they're feeling. Like that's not a place we can start. And of course, I'm not a therapist or a psychiatrist or anything like that. But I really love this. When you're talking about the harm reduction with going toward healthier things, I'm always talking about how can people balance their food and how can we start to crowd out the ultra processed foods instead of get rid of all of it. It's like, yeah, maybe in the end we will get there, but today you're not ready for it. And I find it's very panicking when we ask people to do too many things all at once. So I really love how you laid this out. How do people get, you explain standing in front of the fridge, like a little bit of working on this tolerance. I've talked to people about, can we set a timer to see if you're actually still hungry? Different things like that. Do you have certain things that you always come to that your patients do well with when they use those strategies?
Yeah, I would say it is in the same way we go to the gym and work out. And it's like some people might grow muscle faster than others, but if you go work out, you're going to get stronger. So with this too, if you practice the art of tolerance, then you will get better at that. So even if you still have this terrible trauma history and you're still very anxious and depressed, an interesting question a lot of people don't address, and the field of psychology hasn't shown enough interest, is why then, if most people would agree and identify with, yes, the addiction is related to some bad feeling that I'm trying to manage, then why do some people have depression or anxiety and other people have depression or anxiety with addiction? And so this is the real key to it, is that intolerance. There is more to it. Often there is a little more, if I may say on the show, like a bucket sort of attitude and feeling. There are certainly other dynamics in here. But as far as the most straightforward way of understanding it, it's that there's an intolerance for the state, whereas someone with depression and no addiction actually is tolerating the feeling of sadness. So even if it's really bad. And so that's the biggest skill to work on specific to addiction or emotional eating, is that. And so back to, yes, anybody who can build any tolerance for that state is on the winning side. And so that could mean standing in front of the fridge or pantry and just sitting with yourself and breathing through it. It could mean distracting yourself when you have those thoughts, whether that's puzzles and apps and games, or going for a walk would, of course, be better. So there's all kinds of distracting techniques, and there's all sorts of other healthy things to do. There's all sorts of mindful tolerances to do. And any of those, just every minute you do, I would view like a workout. And don't just be vague or abstract where it's like, oh God, I really want ice cream. And then just off the cuff come up with something. I would actually recommend to anybody and would work on with people is get scientific and diligent about it, like you would in the gym. You don't just show up at the gym like, I kind of feel like the treadmill. And then the next time, okay, let's do bench press. And the next time it's like, okay, we're going to do this interesting calisthenics. They're all fine. They're okay ideas, but you're not going to get very far in any one of them. So with any of these, any strategy that appeals to someone, just do more of that. And even if it's not working, in the same way you reach a point of failure every time you're at the end of your set working out, right? The same thing here. Even if then you're standing there 2 minutes in, you're like, I can't, and you grab something. It's like, fine, follow that. See if you can get that up to 3 minutes or longer. What you will see, much in the same way in psychiatry, we use this as there's exposure and response kinds of treatments where people with either OCD or other kinds of phobias, we're generally treating them by exposure where we help them get on the other side of it, where usually it takes an hour of some exposure to neurologically learn and see that there is another side to it. So here too, when you can kind of reach a certain breaking point where I can just stand here and not partake, there is a point where you're on the other side of it, and it's very empowering because there is a learned behavior where every time I'm feeling bad, then I think of, let's just say it's ice cream, that doesn't go away and a tension internally builds until I partake.
Yeah.
And so we're learning every time I'm just going to get more tension and more craving and want this more until I just do it. So then we learn to just do it. But the other side of that is once we can learn to tolerate it through that feeling, and it always goes away. It is definitely a wave of a feeling implying that it goes up, but it crests and then it does go down. Always, 100% of the time. Guarantee everybody that. So when you can go on the other side of it, you've broken through, it's very empowering. And that doesn't mean you're not going to get swept up or be successful every time going forward, but you become emboldened. You see that there's something that can be done. You start to realize there is a you in there that can master something. You're not just the object of addiction and emotional eating, and I just can't do anything about it.
Yeah. I love so many great things you said here, how you need to decide ahead of time what these strategies are that you're going to implement. When you have an urge, I always say it feels urgent. You want to take immediate action. And it happens so fast. That's when I find when people are starting to work on things, they almost don't even know what's happening. How do people slow it down? Because again, usually they're on the other end of it and they're like, oh, I did that. They'll be making dinner and they're not even realizing that they're kind of putting things in their mouth as they're going. And that grazing behavior is leading to things that are not amazing for them. Do you have any strategies for, do they pick the situations that they know occur and then they work on those? Or do you see common patterns with that?
Yeah. Most people know common sense. Set yourself up for success and try things at the right dose or frequency or timing where you can actually do the damn thing, or else you're just setting up failure. Okay. In the same way we set up light weights to begin, or you don't go for 2 hours the first time. So same thing here. We're not going to try this on like the worst day. So a lot of people do say, okay, this is such a bad day, or the feelings are so strong. Okay, now I remember I need to practice this thing, but that's the worst time to practice. If you can understand that rationale, I explain this just so people aren't just doing only what
No, this
I
is
say,
perfect because people beat themselves up, right? They're trying things at a time where it's impossible to be successful. And then they're like, see more evidence that I can't do. It's like, you lost your job that day. Why would you that day start a new emotional eating habit, right? So no, this is perfect. People need to hear this. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, if you understand why, well, then from what I said, hopefully then people can say, okay, there are some common sense ideas I can come up with. Okay, maybe as far as like frequency, dose, timing and stuff, maybe that means at work, my snacks can be harm reduced so that I've controlled something because that's all I have in the drawer. Or it could be that there's middle of the day, it's easier to think of something you really want, but tolerate it.
Yeah.
You might be able to win in those smaller doses or not terrible moments. And at home too, work on standing in front of the fridge or pantry on a good day where you're actually tasking yourself and prompting yourself, do I want ice cream? And practicing being able to stand there when it's not necessarily this huge, strong urge on a terrible day. So starting with that and being able to stand there long enough would be an example. Again, there's lots of other mechanisms and strategies to practice, but that's just an example of set up to do it well. Because then when you have a bad day, I would generally expect that you're not going to be able to do it. But if instead of having a whole lot of what the thing is, either less, or that you've just warded it off for a little extra time, and that is to be thought of as a workout. That muscle in your brain got worked out more than it would have if you didn't try to practice anything.
I have to tell you, this episode, it's going to break our podcast when we put it up because everyone always views it as a failure when they're not perfect. And I'm always like, you're not supposed to be perfect. The goal is less, not none, all of that. But this language that you say where it's a workout, you're going to get stronger at it. That's still, you go to failure. There might still be a failure at the end. I never define failure, but I think this is such an incredibly helpful lens. I have a kind of a follow-up question for this. Let's imagine that someone has started to work on this. They're working with someone. They're getting stronger at it. A lot of things are going amazing. And what I often experience is that they'll be doing great for a few months. And then I want to use the word regress, but everything suddenly gets hard. They're like, did I forget everything I learned, right? And of course, that shame comes with that. What comments do you have for that person? Because I see this universally with weight management. This is part of it. You almost have to expect it. But what do you offer to people in those moments?
There's all kinds of nuances to that. Doing what I do, right, there's all kinds of questions around common trope would be, is this self-sabotage? Are you afraid of success? I see a lot of patients, especially women who have been sexually abused at some point in their life. They start to get more attractive, and then that scares them. And this isn't a conscious process usually. There's all kinds of reasons that people don't want to get noticed. They don't want attention. They don't want then other people pressuring because now it's like, oh, it's going well. Now I've got to live up to that pressure. Maybe you had reasons you weren't going out or doing social things because of your weight, and now you don't have as much of an excuse. I'm just trying to show you there's so many psychological reasons that people don't continue to be assertive or have success in life. It could be really unfamiliar and just not know how to manage certain things. So there's a lot of reasons. But my ultimate point there would be you have to be curious about what's happening. Don't say, oh, well, see, look, I just can't. It is just so silly to have that conclusion.
Yeah.
And it's like, again, going into the gym and then you stop going to the gym. Look, I'm not going to be able to work out anymore. What do you mean? You were going and now you're not. Just say that. Challenge anybody to just say the thing and be specific. And often what I'm doing is just helping people to get very particular with their language. So you say, I can't do this. Well, what do you mean? No, you can do this. And then there's times or situations where it doesn't feel like you can or you cannot sustain that. And now we have questions. Why? And then you, after a while, realize it's actually not so confusing. Maybe you have bad problems in the relationship again. It had nothing to do with your own intrinsic motivation, but something was coming up in the marriage again or some other deadline or something. There's curiosity to be had in those times.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Again, really powerful stuff. Really good. Really just say that, but don't heap other stuff on it. And the curiosity aspect, everyone always forgets that. Do you think that there's anything that we didn't talk about today that just with this sort of just beginning the conversation, because obviously this is all super complex and goes deeper, but anything else that you think would be important for listeners to hear just with what we've talked about?
I think maybe just to recap and say some of the things that a lot of people miss is that even though it is just complex and nebulous around emotional eating and it feels like an addiction, it's just too complicated. You can, with science and psychology and behavioral science, there are real ways to work through this. And so if you haven't encountered those yet, or you haven't had good guidance, or it's been just too vague what people say to try harder or just be disciplined or just buy healthier things. If you're not finding like truly psychologically relevant guidance or answers, keep looking because they're there and there's so much. There's so many things. We're just giving a very basic overview here. There's so much that can be done where I truly believe everyone can be successful in it. So it is a matter of meeting the right guidance. And so seek that out, please, and remain curious if you're struggling and then you're just beating yourself up or not finding a helpful strategy. Stay curious and find that because it can always get better. For sure, for sure.
I love that you bring this up. If I think about how many coaches and people that I have involved on my journey continue to this day, there is not a time within business, health, whatever it is, where I'm not getting help. And I think old me, probably 10 plus years ago, would have viewed that as a failure. Well, why do you need anyone? And now I'm like, why would I ever not? Why would I ever? I mean, I can't see all the perspectives with my brain. I have found that it helps with leaps and bounds going forward versus you just making these little steps, getting the right help. Someone that has a perspective that just resonates with you. A lot of what you're saying, I'm not going to lie, I want to run and join your program because it really resonates the way in which you're talking about stuff. So I love that everybody like keep going till you get the right help. Can you tell everybody about how can they find you both clinically and then the program that you offer at large? Can you tell us a little bit about all of that?
Yeah, clinically, I just treat people in Texas because where my license is. That's at hochmanhealth.com. But yeah, I made the program because there's people all over the world that struggle with addiction, and there's so much bad treatment and quackery out there. It's just a way anybody can access it. It's at selfrecovery.org. And yeah, people can just go to the website and enroll. It's just super simple. You just put in email and contact info and then you're inside. It's an on-demand program, so you can start whenever, and there's optional groups in there that's included, but that's just on demand and you get to learn everything you need to know about addiction, but ultimately yourself. You really gain mastery with it. Yeah, it is that simple though. Just go to the website. It's pretty self-explanatory.
Amazing. So we'll make sure in the show notes, everybody that's listening, if you go to rentiaclinic.com/blog, we'll have, when this episode airs, we'll make sure to have the links to all of this. So if anyone's listening, you didn't write it down, it'll be in the show notes underneath where you're listening, also on the website. Thank you so much for coming on today. I know I always learn so much, and just thank you for taking the time and for just helping all of us to understand this differently.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I think it's often an overlooked angle to diet and nutrition and weight management. So thanks for giving attention.
Thanks so much. That marks the end of today's episode. But if you're newer to the podcast, I want to tell you about something that we have, and it's a free podcast roadmap. So this is perfect for any of you that are listening where you want to be directed to very specific episodes. So let's say that you are just starting out and you want to know, what should I do right when I start on the medications? Or you're experiencing certain side effects on the GLP-1s, or you want to know what to do if you're in a plateau, or if emotional eating is taking over, or if hunger levels are high. So we have many different categories of episodes that we've talked about, because there's a lot at this point. So if you want to be able to navigate that very easily, we have it broken down by category and also the episodes that are there, and we hyperlink to everything. So you can just click on it and find the episode, easy peasy. If you want that, you can go to rentiaclinic.com/podcast roadmap. We'll have it linked right here underneath the show notes where you're listening. And you can go ahead and get that free resource so that it makes it easy for you to navigate, because I know that it's really hard when someone has an established podcast. I am such a podcast fiend. I'm listening to podcasts all day long. And when I find one that I love, but there's a lot that are out there, I am so lost. So I hope that you enjoy this free podcast roadmap. Again, the link to get to that is going to be rentiaclinic.com/podcast roadmap. I hope this is helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.